Is Professor Davids. I'm in the psychology department here at Westminster. Today you're here joining us for our career development panel with two psychologists who are women of color here in the Salt Lake community, so they can share some of their insights and wisdom related to coming into psychology as a profession. This is a part of our series of events for I Am Psyched, which is a group of events that are in conjunction with the American Psychological Association, focusing on the past, present, and future of women of color in psychology. So we have our two panelists with us today. The first one is Dr. Cone-Uemura, who is a staff psychologist and the group coordinator at the University of Utah Counseling Center. Karen previously has a background in nutrition and clinical dietetics, and then made a career transition into counseling psychology, getting her PhD at the University of Utah in their educational psychology department in counseling psychology. We also have Dr. Jinna Lee, who is a psychologist and the coordinator of the practicum training at the Salt Lake City VA here in town. Dr. Lee has her PhD from the University of Utah as well in counseling psychology. Dr. Lee, in addition to doing practicum training, she is also a part of the post-traumatic stress disorder clinical team, and also runs, founded and is running the first group up at the VA for women of color. So both of you, we appreciate your time here this morning, and welcome. I should also make one final recommend, or I'll do one more introduction. We've got Grace Lundquist, who is the co-coordinator for the I Am Psyched events that we're doing here and is a student in psychology and gender studies here at Westminster. So to begin this morning, I'd like to ask each of you to please just begin by sharing a bit about who you are, the current job that you have, and why you decided to enter the career that you're currently in.
Uh-oh. I'm going to fail the first test.
There we go.
All right. Thank you so much for having me here this morning. So like Chris said, I am a psychologist at the VA, where we serve military veterans. And most of my clinical work is on the PTSD team. So basically, all the veterans I see have post-traumatic stress disorder, with the exception of the veterans who come to the Veterans of Color group. I also do some administration, so when you study to be a psychologist, there are lots of levels of training, as you've probably heard. And one of the levels is practicum, which means that when you're still taking classes, you are going to do work as a psychologist. You're really getting your feet wet, working with patients. And I coordinate that for students all around the valley to come do that at our hospital. So the reason why I picked psychology, I took a curvy road to this profession, not a straight one. I actually started out as a documentary filmmaker, and I studied film in college, and I made some short films, and it was fantastic. I loved it. But I realized that I was more interested in the subjects of my documentary than in making a good film about them. I loved hearing their stories. I loved getting to know them, and that was the part that I felt passionate about. So I went and I did a little bit of college teaching at UC San Diego in communication, which kind of was, I see that as kind of like a midway point in between psychology and film. And I loved the teaching part of that as well, and getting to know my students and hearing their stories and their hopes and dreams, and kind of helping them along that path. So that was one of the reasons I picked psychology, and that's still my favorite part of the job, just getting to know people in a really meaningful and deep way, really knowing, what are their deepest fears, their deepest hopes, what has caused them pain, what brings them joy, and it's just fascinating for me. We are all so different and so alike at the same time, and I just love that. But the reason I picked counseling psychology in particular is because of the multicultural and social justice part of it. So I had students come to me when I was teaching in communication and say, "You are the only Asian professor I've had who's not in the sciences and who's in humanities," and it meant so much to them. And that really touched me and made me think about how important it is to have representation in all professions, and I wanted to be part of that. And so counseling psychology and specifically I chose because that's a place where you can have that focus on diversity and multiculturalism and social justice.
So I'm Karen, and I'm at the University of Utah, and like Jinna, I have had a really very curvy road to get to this point. So after I graduated from high school a million years ago, I wanted to go into psychology, and I was not as intentional and thoughtful in my choices back then. And so I had scholarships and full funding to go to a little liberal arts college in Oakland, California. I grew up in Gilroy and Hollister, California. Does anybody know where that is? Are you kidding?
Garlic?
Yes, garlic and earthquakes. So Gilroy's the garlic capital and Hollister's the earthquake capital. And anyway, at that time, I made a decision. I was really scared to move away from home. And I had this boyfriend, so I decided, I'll stay and go to the community college. And there I met with an advisor, and he said, you want to go into psychology? That's going to take a long time with your great math and science, which now as I look back on it, I was good at math and science, but I also wonder if he saw this East Asian face and thought, oh, good at math and science. Anyway, he said, you should go into engineering because you could be done in 4 years, you could make a lot of money. And I thought, that sounds good. So I ended up going to junior college, and I was planning to become, that would have been really on the forefront of computer science, but I hated it. I loved programming and I loved all of that, but all the physics, it was physics that I hated, and so I thought, oh no, I hate this. Did 2 years there, thought, I'm committed to hard sciences, went to UC Santa Barbara, majored in chemistry because after all I had all these hard sciences. At UC Santa Barbara I took an abnormal psychology class and I loved it, but I thought, oh, I can't major in psychology, it's too late. And I was all of, 19 or 20, and it was too late. And so then I thought, oh, I'm still miserable, transferred up to UC Berkeley, and I thought, what can I do with all this hard science in my background? And actually, at UC Santa Barbara, I decided, I'll become a dietitian because I love talking to people about health and what they eat and things like that. So that's why I transferred up to UC Berkeley, graduated from there. But in April of the year that I was graduating, I thought, oh, I hate this. I can't do this. I don't like it at all. But I did. I graduated May of that same year, worked for a year and a half as a clinical dietitian, registered dietitian, and then decided I hate all of this, I hate my life, et cetera, so I joined the Peace Corps. And there, both working as a dietitian in San Francisco with many people of color, older people of color, I started to realize it's never too late. I was fascinated with their stories and their lives. And so that's why I joined the Peace Corps. There I learned so much more about culture, about myself, about the importance of doing what you're passionate about and not what makes money. So then I came back to the States and got my master's in counselor education. Then I did the whole marriage thing, and we moved to Utah. We were going to stay here a couple years back in '95. and so then I thought, well, I think I'd like to become a psychologist. And I chose counseling psychology because it had the word counseling in it. And I thought, well, that's like a counselor education program, but they're totally different. They have different cultures, and that's what's also fascinating. But I was here in Utah. There was a counseling and a clinical program. I saw the word counseling and applied to it and have been very happy. I was 37 when I entered my doctoral program, so it's never, ever too late.
Great, thank you. So could you just tell us a little bit more about, on a typical day, what your job looks like?
No, I'm just kidding. It's okay. So, like I said, I wear a few different hats. In terms of my clinical position, so that means seeing patients, doing psychotherapy. We call them patients because we're at a hospital. I see probably about 4 individual patients a day on average. I'd say 3 to 5 is a typical range. And so that means just what you think of as psychotherapy. I sit down with them, we talk for about an hour, and I do treatment, mostly of PTSD. Not all, because people with PTSD have lives and they have other problems too, but generally focused on trauma. So the rest of my day, I usually have a meeting. The VA is a huge system. There are a huge amount of clinicians and other people there. We all have to work together. So that's an important part too, is coordinating and fitting in with the rest of the hospital and figuring out how we can all work together. And then I might run a group on some days. Meeting with 5 to 7 people at a time and just facilitating that kind of group psychotherapy. And then I also spend time, as I mentioned, coordinating. So you might wonder, what does that look like? In terms of what it looks like, it's like sending lots of emails. I send tons of emails. Answering emails is a huge part of my job. It's like, I email this program, hey, how are you guys doing? What are your programs? What do you need from us? Email this program, and then they email me, how are our students doing? I tell them how their students are doing, and hey, I need you to sign this paper, I need you to sign this paper. It's a lot of that kind of stuff, putting out fires. If a student is struggling, their supervisor will email me, and we'll figure out, okay, what's going on with this student? How can we get them back on track? And having meetings, and just seeing that everything runs smoothly, and having tons of Excel sheets with all the different obligations I need to meet, and just trying to be really organized. So that would be probably an hour or 2 of my day. Make just stuff, making phone calls, things like that. And this is not quite answering your question, but the thing that makes that fun is the atypical days as well, which is when I get to do things like this. I get to go out and meet you all, and I get to meet other groups who want to learn about PTSD or about veterans, and I do presentations about race and racism, and I love that too. That's not typical, but I get to do that every month or 2, so that keeps it fun.
Well, what I love about my job is that there is really no typical day. So we call the folks that we see clients. And so probably in a week, I'll see a total of about 10 or so individual clients. And I run 3 groups. So this is the clinical work I do. But what I also love is the fact that our counseling center, so sometimes we have crises that we deal with. This week, a young man was murdered, and so we were able to provide crisis counseling to the different offices and campus partners. So we do that. That's not as frequent, but it's very important. But what I love is that I get to meet with the different offices that have to do with diversity. We're really trying to, the U is recognizing the importance of inclusion, and that it's not just talking about it, but it's actually doing it. And so they're being very intentional and very thoughtful in the different kinds of programs and different kinds of things that they're doing. So I love that, because the counseling center is part of that, and I get to, so I'm going to be starting this group with an office called CESA, which is the Center for Ethnic Student Affairs, and we're going to be doing some sociodrama, which is really fun. It's you just learn so much about social issues and what you can do about them. So I get to do that. I work with supervisees, which are people that are studying to be psychologists, and I get to supervise them. I provide trainings about group. I coordinate the groups program, which is a lot of emails and meeting with people and just promoting and finding out what kinds of groups are people wanting. Chris and I actually co-facilitated a group together, which was a lot of fun. I'm very active in a lot of different professional associations. So there's a group called the American Group Psychotherapy Association, and I do a lot of work with them, promoting racial and ethnic awareness, cultural humility, things like that. I just wrote a book chapter. It's really fun. No day is typical.
Yeah, so it sounds like for both of you, look at you while I'm talking to you, that there's a lot of different hats that you wear in your role. So even though you were both trained in counseling psychology, it's not that you're strictly only doing clinical work, but you have a lot of different job responsibilities. So I want to let the audience know that in a couple minutes, we'll check in and see if anybody has questions. So start thinking about those if there's anything that you want to ask, and we'll kind of alternate between some of the questions that we prepared and then also questions that you are curious about to learn from our panelists. The next question I wanted to ask about is, I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts on barriers that you feel like are in place within psychology that make it harder for women of color to be in psychology compared to other groups.
Yes. Yes, I do.
Done.
No, so I'm going to try to categorize my response in two ways. One, I think there are barriers that you're going to face in almost any profession as a woman of color, and I wish that weren't true, but that's the world we live in right now. And you guys could probably tell me about them. That you're not seen in a certain way, right? When people think of someone who's in leadership, who has authority, and they just picture that person in their brain, they're probably not picturing someone who looks very much like you. And so when you're in that position, it feels weird. And I don't think people even realize it. I think it's very subconscious. I don't think it's intentional. But it's just like, oh, you're the one in charge? Like, there's just a little dissonance there. And I think that comes out in a lot of different ways that are very insidious, that make you question, is this real? Am I really seeing this? Is it not? I mean, that's the reality of it. And so that's very difficult to be in that environment where people around you, without even realizing it, are constantly kind of undercutting you in ways that they don't even see, by just kind of coming at you with that assumption of like, I'm not sure this person is qualified to do what she's doing. And that's tough. It's really tough. You have to develop a very thick skin and have lots of support around you and people you can complain to and get validation from, because your environment often will not provide that for you. But I think that's true in any profession. I mean, it's hard for me to think of a profession you could go into as a woman of color where you're not going to face that. But it has a good side. It does make you very tough, and I think it really helps. It forces you to like reach inside of yourself for that belief in yourself and knowing who you are. So I think that's actually like dealing with any adversity. It does help you build strength. In terms of psychology specifically, it's interesting. So when people come to probably me and you, Karen, they haven't picked me. Because I'm not in private practice, so they didn't look at a list and say, I'm going to see this person. I was just assigned to them. And I think they're often surprised, especially at the VA, that I am their provider. And I think that first session is really interesting because I'm about to ask them about things that are so private that they have not maybe even told their wife or their parents, things that are so private to them that I've never spoken. I'm going to ask them about those things. Like, we have to have a relationship of trust. And then they're kind of looking at me like, oh my gosh, are you going to understand me? You look so different from me. So I think that is a barrier. I think it's just, it's not an insurmountable one. Absolutely not. But I think it leads a little bit of that extra, I think you have to do a little extra work in that first session to reassure people, yes, you can trust me, I will understand you. This is going to be okay. It's all right. It's going to be okay. And then again, I think that turns into a strength too. I think being able to form that trust and that relationship across cultures, across different backgrounds, can also be really powerful. But yeah, I think it's a unique barrier.
And so, Dr. Lee, that reminds me of a previous panel that we did where a woman of color psychologist had shared being in private practice that often she'll sense hesitation in phone calls or confusion from people, sometimes where potential clients will say, you know, like, I don't mean any offense by this, but I just don't know if this would work. Or maybe that they're surprised when they call because they read the person's name and assume that they don't speak English well. Or we wouldn't even know, but there's probably people who maybe look at a picture on an online profile and choose not to call because they assume the person won't speak well or they won't understand my experience. And so that sounds similar to some of the barriers you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I want to say I've also had outright racism. Like, I'm kind of talking about like that more subconscious like stuff, but I've also had people be like, I do not want to see an Asian woman. Like, what are you doing here? Like, I've had that too. And that's tough. But we've dealt with that on a case-by-case basis, and I'm fortunate to have a team around me to help me with that kind of thing. And sometimes I've worked with those folks. Sometimes I have not. So that happens too. But that's rare. That's rare. That's maybe, it's a handful. It's under 5 times. Like, I've been at the VA for like 8 years. And, but that's happened too.
And I agree with Jinna that a lot of the barriers that we face actually end up strengthening me. So I did my internship at the VA, and again, I'm just kind of a naive person that goes into the world sometimes and doesn't think about things deeply. And I remember at the VA, when I got my internship there, even before I found out, I decided to get this big old tattoo on my arm. And I remember when I actually went to the VA, when they said, oh yeah, you matched with us, you're gonna be here for a year, that I covered the tattoo because it felt like, oh my gosh, this does not feel right. And then it got really hot, so I decided I'm gonna let it show. And actually the veterans warmed up to me more. And then they would call me a civvy, like, you sure know, you know what, you're okay for a civvy. That means a civilian, because I've never been in any sort of military or whatnot. But anyway, I digress. So I feel very fortunate at the UCC, where I'm at, the University of Utah Counseling Center, because it is a real team feel, and we really focus on issues of inclusion. We focus on things that are called microaggressions. So for example, my Asian face, when I first moved to Utah, I remember a very well-meaning young white woman said to me at a photography place, you know, you really speak English well. And I said, oh, thanks. And then she said, where are you from? I said, oh, I'm from California, because I thought, oh, how cool, someone's asking. No, where are you from? And then again, it's like, oh, you just want to know my ethnicity. Well, I'm already not in the mood to talk to you, so blankety blank you. In my head, of course, I wouldn't say that out loud. But yeah, actually I might now. I'm so old, I kind of don't give a beep. But the barriers in psychology, because the American Psychological Association was founded by white, straight, cisgender males, and now it's totally different. And I remember for a good number of years, I thought, oh yeah, I can foment some change in that big organization. And so I was really active in the Utah Psychological Association and went to DC to lobby our legislators, like for 6 years. Then I just got burnt out. I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is hard work. So there are barriers. Like Jinna was saying, there's barriers in everything, and we can let that defeat us, or we can rally our strength by getting support, reaching out to people that are supportive, and then getting back into the fray. So yes, the barriers that I faced, and definitely as a person of color, but also as a woman. Like, it took me 10 years to finish my PhD. And the American Psychological Association doesn't want you to take that long. But I was a mom, my kids were young. I wanted to be able to, and I had the privilege to not have to plow through, but I got into a lot of trouble. Every year I'd get these letters like, please explain why you're not done yet. Please explain why you're not done yet. So there are systemic barriers, but if you can just find support, tap into that strong part of yourself, then you can make it through. But the important thing is to find support, and I'm really, really lucky because where I work is really supportive. I have a really small private practice, and people that choose me because they said, oh, I looked you up online and you understand microaggressions, you understand racism, you understand sexism, and so I want to give you a shot. And then I also am bilingual in, guess what language? Just shout out something. Oh my gosh, that's not right. Yes, but a lot of people would think Mandarin or Japanese, but yes, I'm bilingual in Spanish. And so anyway, workers' comp sends Spanish-speaking clients that have been injured, and I really enjoy that a lot, but yeah.
Great, thank you. So does anybody from the audience have a question that they want to ask? Okay.
On their behalf.
Okay. Yeah.
We will, and I don't know if you want to get into this. If you don't, it's okay. We will be studying later in our year. These are my AP psychology students. So we'll be studying therapy. I'm interested if either of you would speak a little bit more to, we'll talk about different types of therapy and different methodologies. So which ones specifically you use in your practice? If there's anything like that you want to share, I think it'd be useful for them.
Okay. So the question was, what types of therapy do you use in your practice? And just to describe a little bit more about that.
So at the VA, there's a very strong commitment to what's called evidence-based treatment. That means ones that have been through randomized trials and have shown to have efficacy against, like, I don't know, whatever. So you kind of, I spoiled you all. Okay, so let's say, I love them. I love them. They're great. They're effective. And they're mostly based on they're forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of the big monolith. It's what most of these kinds of treatments are based on, is this cognitive behavioral approach. And I think it's great. It's so helpful. It can help so many people, and they're manualized, which means you get an outline of what you need to do in each session, and you need to go through that outline in each session and do it with your patients. And I think they're really, really helpful, really powerful. I think everyone who has PTSD should do one. So do I believe in them? Yes. Do I not believe in them? Yes. I also do not believe in them. Because, like I said, people with PTSD are not diagnoses. They're people. And people don't always work the way they're supposed to work, or the way they work in studies, or the way the DSM says they're supposed to work. You have to get to know them as people. And so I'm very fortunate to be at a VA where, even though the VA huge system approach is everyone has to do EBT, everyone has to do EBT, which we do, and I do, and I want to do. But I have the flexibility in my hospital to, okay, this is not working for you right now, we're going to do something else. This is not the right time for you, we're not going to do this now, or you've done this, good job, but you're still having problems, and so we're still going to meet and do other stuff. So I love that. I have flexibility to do this manualized structured approach, and then to also do what you're going to learn is, I guess, more Rogerian, more just client-centered, patient-centered, letting them lead the way, not that they're following me, that I'm following them.
Yeah, evidence-based is so important in certain places. So my background in therapy is with something called psychodrama, which is an experiential approach. And that's what I did through my whole counselor education program. As I said, counseling and psychology are really different cultures. So when I came here and was in the counseling psychology program, I thought, oh, I want to do psychodrama. And they looked at me like, what's that? What evidence is there to show that it works? And I didn't even know, at that time, I didn't even know what evidence-based meant. I said, I don't know. So I stopped doing it. But my heart is in experiential therapies. And now that I've been licensed for a while, I don't do much CBT, although that is really helpful for different diagnoses or different things that people bring in. But I do a lot of interpersonal work. So I let people know on the first session, like, this is use this session to see if I'll be a good fit for you. If not, we can transfer you to another clinician in the agency. But the way I work is interpersonally, and so I'll, for example, find out what their goals are, and I let them know straight out, we're not gonna solve problems that you have in your life here. What we'll do is work on you so that you are stronger and emotionally more resilient to be able to handle your problems. And so sometimes people don't like that because that sounds like a lot of work. And it is, but it's really fun. So I use experiential. I do role play. I do a lot of talk therapy, things like that.
Okay. So what are some of the reasons you believe it is important for there to be women of color in psychology? And what do you believe people from this group contribute to the profession that is unique?
So does anyone know what portion of the population in the U.S. is white men? Anyone want to guess? Sorry? 75? Anyone? Any other guesses? It feels like 75, doesn't it? When you watch TV, right? Open a newspaper, read a magazine, it's like, it feels like it's 75%. It's 35, it's like 35. 35% of the US population is white men. Doesn't that feel weird? Yeah. Because it's about 70% white, right? About 70% white, and about half of them are men. So it's like 35% white men. It doesn't feel that way, does it? They're in the minority, you guys. They're the minority. It just doesn't feel that way. If we don't recognize the reality of that and address it, we are going to fail, and it's unethical. It is unethical if we do not recognize the 65%, I can't do math, the 65% of human beings in this country who are not white men. Now, I'm married to a white man. I love white men. I love you guys out there. I'm not against you in any way, shape, or form. But there's 65% of people out there who are not white men. We have to serve them. And I don't think that white men can't do it. They can't do it all themselves. There have to be women and people of color doing that work. There have to be.
Yeah, I think that it's very important for, as Jinna was saying, to be represented. You know, unfortunately, we are judged on the package that we inhabit, right? The vehicle that we're using in this lifetime. And so I know that when I look for a therapist, I would prefer someone that looks like me because I think she would experientially get it more. And I have found that to be true. And it's not to say that people who don't look like me aren't effective, but it's just that using an evidence-based theory or technique, for example, on me, Jinna was saying, we are each our own little world. And so things need to be adapted. And I have found that, we just need to have physical representation. Experientially, my experiences are different than someone who, like a straight white male, for example. I've had different experiences because of how I am in the world, how I look in the world. People treat me differently. And so it's very important to have all these perspectives represented in our profession.
Yeah, so it sounds like for both of you, representation feels really important for psychology, but on multiple levels of representation in order to have a diversity of people to meet the diversity of needs that different people have, but also on the level of having diversity of the types of people there are, so we have diversity of thought in terms of the knowledge that we create and share in our discipline, as well as different thinkers and different types of people who are setting policy, who are moving the profession forward. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay.
So I feel like unfortunately it's not uncommon to come across instances of ignorance of people who don't really understand social injustice or like who deny it flat out. So do you think that having a career in psychology kind of better equips you to go out into the world and like help people understand? Because I feel like it's easy to meet someone who's kind of ignorant to that and be like, oh, you're a terrible person? Like, so do you think it kind of helps you go out and have a better understanding?
So the question was, it's not uncommon to have people who don't have much understanding of social justice issues. Do you believe that in your role of psychologist that you have skills that you've learned that help address those issues?
Most definitely, because just as I might have my beliefs or my perspective on something, on an issue, the person on the other side of it also has their reasons and their experiences that led them to their beliefs. And so in order for change to happen, dialogue needs to occur. And I do think psychology prepares us for that, because it can get us out of our just personal digging our heels into thinking a little more globally, like, okay, wait a minute. I want to talk to this person. I want to hear what they have to say. Why are they where they're at? And then we can share, like, okay, and this is where I'm at. And so I think psychology prepares us because we can understand people a little bit better.
I absolutely agree. So one of the things I do, and I mentioned this a little bit, is trainings on racism and how that fits into mental health. And those are really hard. So, okay, let me back up. The population I work with tends to be not like me in many ways, not politically like me, not demographically like me. So I feel like that's a really it's given me a really interesting perspective, because a lot of those folks, the word social justice, which is very dear to me, it's like poison. It's like I said a bad word. And I actually struggle with that. I struggle with that because as a therapist, it's not my job. That's not what they came to me for. They didn't come because they want to be enlightened and they don't want to talk about social justice and race. And so a lot of times I just have to kind of eat that, which is hard. And I care about them. So it's a weird thing. So these trainings I do are mostly for psychology trainees, and I do love doing that training, and I think it's really important. At the same time, I've started to feel recently it's like we're all of these little bubbles, you know what I mean? Like I kind of feel like I'm preaching inside of my bubble, and that these people already care about what I care about, and like I wish there was some way for me to preach outside of my bubble. So I'm not sure how to do that, honestly. I'm still thinking about it. It's something that I want to do because I completely agree with Karen. I think that we do have unique skills as psychologists to, it's almost like you have to learn how to efface yourself in a certain way to really step into someone's shoes and see the world from their point of view. To the extent that sometimes I've had to step in someone's shoes of someone who hates me, and that's a really weird experience to have for me. But I think that is something that could really help bridge between these bubbles somehow, but I'm not exactly sure what that would look like. But I'm thinking about how to try to do that kind of work.
So I wanted to follow up to what you had said, Dr. Lee. You said sometimes when you have these experiences, where essentially people come in with opinions that may be somehow biased, or they're an affront towards social justice, which is a value of yours. You said you have to eat it sometimes. And when I heard that, what I understood of that is that as the clinician, that your role is to meet the needs and address the needs of the client that you're working with, and that it may not be a space for you to bring in your own feelings and experience there. I imagine that also takes a toll. Are we having an issue? Okay. Sorry, we're just gonna. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It takes a toll. So if you're going to go into psychology, especially, well, not, I shouldn't say especially, but like clinical work, like self-care, right? Oh my gosh, so important, no matter who you are, because you are taking on people's pain and their suffering and their, all that stuff that's so hard. It's a burden, and we've all taken it home, right? So self-care is so important, and I think it's important for everyone, but it's important for women of color. to have that. So what's the word someone told me once? You shouldn't just aim for self-care, you should aim for exquisite self-care. That was the word. I thought that was beautiful, of like just recognizing how precious you are as a human being, having that community of people that you can be like, oh my gosh, can you believe what happened today, and just letting it out is so important. You got to treasure those people in your life and have them in your life, and yeah. And sometimes you got to know when you need to step back. Like, I think that's another thing. Like, as psychologists, we love to take care of people, and sometimes we don't know how to say no. And I've had to learn, like, I got to say no sometimes. And I'm not great at it still, but I'm learning, I'm practicing.
One other thing I wanted to add to the original question about does studying psychology give you the skills to address those injustices? So the responses you shared talked about that in terms of having clinical training. And I think one thing that we could also add to that is thinking about psychologists as being scientists and learning how to research those questions and use that research to help us apply that understanding on how can we make change on different levels as well through better understanding using science, human behavior.
I have stacks of articles on my desk about white privilege, cultural humility, microaggression studies that have been done, because I base my clinical practice, it is based in research. I mean, I don't just pull stuff out of wherever. I read articles, and thankfully there are people that do research in the areas that, even though I don't explicitly promote social justice in the therapy room, because I'm socially justice informed, it comes through, but I want to empower that client. And so anyway, reading all the research, thank goodness there are people that are doing this research. So how many people out here are interested maybe in going into a career in psychology? Yes, that is awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah, because we definitely need more researchers, more clinicians. I mean, yeah.
Okay, so psychology broadly has to do with how people think, feel, and behave. This means there are lots of ways someone can be a psychologist. Both of you chose to be therapists. So we're wondering what led you to choose this career path, and what other areas of psychology do you think would have been interesting to enter?
So initially I thought academia would be awesome, but I don't want to turn anyone off. And anyway, so research is fantastic, but as I said, I was a mother of young children during my program, and I just did not want to put the time into doing a lot of research, a lot of writing and publishing. And I loved teaching, and so I incorporated that. And like a great profession could have been to be an instructor like in a liberal arts college. But then I also learned through teaching that I suck at grading. And so I would assign these great assignments, but then I'd want to write these really long responses. And when I have 30 students and it's just me, and I'm doing clinical work full-time as well, I realized, that's not my strength. And so that's why I decided I'm going to just focus more on clinical work and training of future psychologists so that they can go out and become researchers and become instructors and researchers, instructors, et cetera, and so that's what made me decide to choose a clinical path. And at the counseling center, I do get to still do some training, and because I do a lot of presentations at like my professional association, that entails literature review types of research. And so I don't go out into the field and do research anymore, just for my dissertation and thesis. But it's a wonderful field to do research in, but too time consuming for me.
So I picked therapy because I just, like I said, I love hearing people's stories. And there's just nothing like, therapy's interesting because you can go along for a long time and just have okay sessions, and then all of a sudden there's like in a session where you see someone's life change before your eyes, and it's super cool. They walk out and they're a different person than they were when they walked in. And I just feed off those sessions of like, that was cool. So I still love it. I still love that. But having said that, one of the fun things about psychology is there's so many things you can do with it. I think teaching would have been great, really great. Just kind of engaging intellectually. I think that the different kind of level of engagement with kind of the issues in psychology. I'll put out there, this is not something that I've done, but I also have friends who do consulting in psychology, and that's huge, and I think that's something that's going to get bigger and bigger. And so they're working with businesses and using what they know from psychology to help those businesses. So for example, there are a number of businesses where people are regularly in contact with trauma, and I bring up trauma because I'm on the PTSD team, so that's what the kind of consulting they do. For example, and you might not think about this, like news reporters. Like news reporters come into constant contact with trauma. They're there on the scene of traumas, and they're talking about traumas and processing it. And so there's some members of my team who have worked with the news departments that you would know, the big news departments in our city, and they've gone to talk to them about how do you manage having this trauma as part of your daily life. That's an example. So consulting is a possibility. Really anything, research, teaching, clinical work, writing. There's just so many different things you can do in this field.
So, Karen, your example that you had provided of when you had said, it could be interesting to go into academia, but then you had said, but that seemed difficult having a family. And I think that for me, what that made me think of is how in psychology, which is similar to any other field, but in psychology, it's important for us to understand the systemic barriers that provide access for certain types of people and make it a little bit easier, and barriers that then make it harder for certain groups, such as a woman of color who's a mother. And so, to be able to enter, say, academia with those identities, it requires us as academia to then think about, not just think about it, but to make change in terms of how we evaluate people who are teaching and how we retain people who are teaching, so that it provides greater access.
Okay. Does anybody have a question that they want to ask?
So, in the field of therapy, psychology, you're working really personally with people, and you're having these really in-depth conversations. And I'm sure it's hard to not always get super attached. So how do you balance that professionalism with the personal work that you do?
Okay, so the question was, in therapy you have very personal interactions. So how do you balance that personal aspect with the professional aspect?
That's a really good question, because I care about my clients, and I realize that that's a time-limited relationship. And so I go into it giving my full caring and recognizing that it will end. And so the way I do it is I appreciate the moment, and then when that time comes when they unfortunately graduate or something like that, and have to move on, we process it. We talk about what it was like to work together, what it's like to end this relationship. And as psychologists, we're ethically bound to not be able to have personal relationships for 2 years. Is that what the ethics code says? 2 years. And if you do develop a relationship, it would have to be for a very extenuating circumstance. And I remember there was this one client, and it's like the magic Jinna was talking about, came in very distressed initially at the beginning of their therapy, lots of trauma, etc. And then I got to see them throughout their college tenure, and they ended up going on to a doctoral program somewhere else and said, I really want to be your friend. And we had talked about this during our time together, and I said, I know, and I would love to be your friend too, and ethically, this can't exist. And at the end of the therapy, they're like, I'm going to wait until 2 years are done, and then I'm going to email you. Can I have your email? And they did, and they caught me up on their life, and that was enough for them. So it's just going in, knowing I'm going to fully care about that person during the time we're working together, and that the relationship will end. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to make some confessions. I love all of my patients. I feel like I'm not supposed to. Like I'm not supposed to say that or something. But how can you not love someone when you get to know them so deeply, right? So it's definitely tough. So the way I see it is like a lot of us who choose psychology go because we're that friend that all of our friends go to, right? A lot of you are that friend, I bet, of like, oh my gosh, can you believe this happened? Like, you tell me what to do. And so I think I naively went in thinking that that was what it meant to be a psychologist. And it's really, really not. Like, it's good that you have that skill. If you have it, that's good. But that's not what it means to be a psychologist. So I've learned that the value of being a psychologist is that precisely that you are not that person. That there's something holy, again, I'm being a bad professional, but I really feel like there's something sacred about the fact that it's separated from that person's life. And so if you were to cross that barrier and have it be that life, that magic wouldn't work anymore. Like there's something about that space. You're coming into a space now that's different. And I'm not part of your life, and this space is not part of your life, and it's not going to last forever the way that your other relationships last. So that's how, I think once you understand it, it feels weird, but it works. It works. We all figure out that it's different from being a friend or being a parent or being in someone's family. And there's a real beauty to the fact that it is separate and limited. But again, it's self-care, like in terms of personally how it happens, you just have to have a full life. You cannot have your job be your life. You have to have a life that's more important outside of your job than inside of your job. Otherwise, you will get sucked in, and you will start to see these people as your friends, and then you don't want to go there.
So we have time for one more question. Okay, so in the white.
So with psychology, it changes like your mindset and the way you see other people's perspective and try to put yourself in their shoes and like see their perspective. So is it hard to not bring your job home and to your friends and to try to and your friends will be like, hey, I'm not your patient. Is it hard?
So the question was, being a psychologist, it's kind of your job to put yourself in other people's shoes, and the question was, is it difficult to not bring that home?
For me, I don't bring it home, but that's because the people I work with, we can process, because the confidentiality is within our agency, so we can talk about our clients there, and so I really do leave my work home, my clinical work, and I have a totally outside life that's not at all related, and that's why I can leave it there. I don't know if everybody has that luxury. I really feel very, very lucky that I can process all the clinical stuff and it just stays at the office. So.
I think I can do it 90% of the time. When I realize that sometimes I bring it home because I have dreams. Sometimes I have dreams that are not my dreams, like they're about my patient's life. It's really spooky. It's like, whoa, that dream wasn't mine, that was someone else's. But yeah, I think that processing in with other people is really, really crucial. I'm fortunate to have that too, because we also have interagency confidentiality, intra-agency confidentiality. So it's like, they give their stories to me, but then I can share their stories the way I need to at work, and then and leave that at home, at work. Freudian slip.
So go ahead and ask Purple Sweater.
Oh, yeah. So I'm interested in correctional psychology, and so I'm wondering if in your practice, if there's been an extreme moment with a patient or a client that had you question your career, and how do you deal with that? How do you develop that kind of patience? I'm really patient,
so the question is, have you had in your careers times where you had some type of experience that really stretched you and made you question being in the profession?
You know, I've had scary experiences, but I've never questioned. Like some of the scary ones, one of them happened at the VA. So we were taught, always sit yourself closest to the door, and then the client, or patient, because they were patients at that time, sits further. And the way my office was structured at the VA, there was a desk, and I had to sit on the other side of the desk, and then my patient was closest to the door. And this was a very large patient. And he got really mad and started pounding on the desk, and everything was shaking in the room. So that was scary, but I just said to him, you know, I'm really scared right now because you're like twice as big as me and you could kill me. And then he said, oh, I'm so sorry. So he didn't realize that he was being scary. Another time I've worked with people who have murdered people, and, you know, that's scary. But because of the fact that I can process that in an agency with others, no, I've never questioned it. I love what I do.
I've never questioned it either. Yeah, I've had extreme moments where one ear I'm on the phone with 911, one ear I'm on the phone with a family member. I'm knocking on doors, trying to get other people to come help. Like we have crisis-y moments. It's not most of what I do. I have to say, I don't particularly find those draining, which is weird. They're kind of energizing. It's almost like your brain goes into this mindset of like survival, and like you get this crystal clear vision of like, I have to just help this person to survive, and then that somehow is almost easier than an ordinary session where you're just sitting with someone, you're like, I'm not sure where to take this, like this is I'm not sure where the meat is, you know what I mean? So if you have that kind of drama-loving personality, it'll be fine. You know, because some people don't thrive in that crisis-y thing, but I think most psychologists have that thing where when there's a crisis, you just kind of everything snaps into place, and you get through it. And it's physically draining, but not emotionally draining. And I've never questioned it. I love psychology.
Okay, so it sounds like I hear you saying you have those difficult moments, but you've kind of prepared yourself to deal with them. And so that allows you to remain within psychology without wanting to leave. Yeah, okay. So you just have one last question before we end. So how do you see psychology changing the future?
How do we see psychology changing the future?
Mm-hmm.
Or changing in the future? Changing in the future.
Changing the future. Yeah.
Ooh, that's a good question, because you're the future. I think that ultimately psychology can bring more peace to the world because of the fact that we can address issues like privilege, we can address issues like access and opportunities that some people, like I am a first-gen college student, and so I didn't even really know about how to do things like that. And so I think with psychology, we can just reach out, educate people more, even on an informal basis. You know, you learn so much that you share with a friend, who shares with a friend, who shares with a family member. So ultimately, I think we can promote peace in the future, which is really necessary.
I agree with that. I think psychologically healthy people are good people to have in the world. And the more we can put psychological health into the world, the better. So, you know, it's interesting because in psychology, like we talked about earlier, you have this intense relationship and then they say goodbye and then you don't really know necessarily what happens with them. But I do believe that. I do believe that the inner peace that we bring into the world, I think, will translate into outer peace.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Cone-Uemura and Dr. Lee for spending some time with us today.